We've just read Romans 9:30 through 10:4. And what I want to talk about today, and then we're going to discuss it over lunch, is what I'm calling the scandal of the gospel. Okay? Now let me explain. We have spent the last 4 weeks in Romans chapter 9 talking about the sovereignty of God. He is fully in control, fully free. He can do anything he wants to do. But also, we've talked about how Paul is making a case for the agency of man. Man is like a little version of God who actually has a tremendous amount of freedom and agency, but it's limited. It's not complete and total the way God's sovereignty is. Okay? And now you get to verse 30, and Paul says, "What shall we say then?" And I just want to mention this. Anytime Paul says in Romans, "What shall we say then?" he's actually introducing a new section. You can see it in the previous chapters. Okay? So in terms of content, the last 4 verses of Romans 9 actually kind of belong thematically with what he's going to talk about in Romans 10. Make sense? He's going from sovereignty to something new, a new concept, a new idea, and that new idea, and this is what you ought to be like, what? It's scandal. All right? You can see it right there in verse 33. Look at it again. "Behold, I am laying in Zion a stone of stumbling and a rock of offense." Now, what Paul is actually doing is he's quoting 2 passages from Isaiah, and he's putting them together. He's blending them. He's taking Isaiah 28, okay, and he's blending in Isaiah 8. And the word in Isaiah 8, and it gets picked up here, when it's translated into the Greek, okay, offense is literally the word in Greek, scandalon. Okay? In other words, Isaiah in the Old Testament says that when God does his thing, there is going to be something scandalous and offensive about it. But whoever believes in him, and he's talking about Messiah, whoever believes in him in faith and trusts themselves to him won't be put to shame. Okay? Now listen. Christianity is the only faith that I know of that says there is something fundamentally scandalous and offensive about its message. Okay? About the message, about the Messiah, and about the nature of God himself. It trips people up. In most religions, they're like, no, nothing about us trips anything. Like if you just believe, you won't trip on anything. And Christianity actually says, no, there is something about the very nature of God, the way he speaks and the way he works, that trips some people up. They're going to find it scandalous and offensive. And yet other people at the exact same time go, oh my gosh, in spite of the scandal, this is breathtakingly beautiful, and they find God. Do you see what I'm saying? Christianity says there is something about this faith. In other words, if you're not seeing any scandal or challenge in Christianity, you're probably not seeing the real Christianity. Okay? And what I want to talk to you about today is why does that happen? First of all, it's not, most of the time when we hear scandal, it's because somebody did something bad. There's a fault, there's a defect, there's a flaw. And Christianity actually says the scandal is not that God did anything bad. It's that he did something so shocking, it actually is on the verge of offensive. Some people find it offensive, some people find it beautiful. Shocking, scandalous, okay? And what I want to talk about is like, okay, well, what is that thing? So I really want to, in other words, if scandal is a big part, Paul goes from sovereignty to scandal, and we need to understand why is he making that connection? And that's what I want to try to show you today. And we're just going to look at this idea of scandalon. Scandal of the gospel, scandal of Christianity. So 3 things we want to talk about. The breadth of the scandal. Okay, in other words, it's all over the New Testament. It's not just in this passage and it's not just in Paul. I want to talk about the breadth of the scandal, kind of how wide it is. I want to talk about the depth of the scandal. This passage shows us how deep it goes right after sovereignty. There's something really important here. Okay? And then I want to show you the power of scandal. The breadth of scandal, the depth of scandal, the power of scandal. I actually believe that when you understand this scandal thing, the scandal of the gospel, and this is the only place I've ever found anything like this in a religious faith, that when you understand this, it's shocking, but it also has the potential to utterly demolish identity politics. And I want to try to explain a little bit about that today if I can. It has the potential to completely rewire how we move through life. Okay? It is like spiritual dynamite. Now, here's what I mean by this. With dynamite, let's say you're in prison. You got some dynamite. Well, guess what? You have the potential to bust yourself out or blow yourself up. One of those 2 things. And that is actually what this scandalizo, it's what Jesus is. Some people get blown up by it. And they're like, I cannot have anything to do with this. And other people are actually liberated by it. So that's what I'm going to try to talk about today. Small passage, really significant. We're going to see if I can explain it. And then we'll talk about it over lunch. Okay, let's talk about the breadth of the scandal. Breadth just means wide, right? Have you ever noticed how there are things in the Bible that actually make it harder for people to believe? So if you were God, think about this, and you wanted people to believe, wouldn't it have been easier to just leave some parts out? Like the Old Testament, you know? In other words, there are chunks that we're like, man, it'd be way easier to believe if that weren't in there, okay? Think about this, and this is not just true like the Old Testament or certain verses. The fundamental nature of the story. I want you to think about how many scandalous things there are, and I'm just going to focus on the New Testament for a second. But it's all throughout, really. Listen, the Greeks, they're all about wisdom. They're the philosophers of the day. And Christianity says God came down in the flesh as a human? Come on. That would mean like God pooped. I'm serious. That's how the Greeks were. They were like, no, listen, the deities are above all of that messiness of humanity.
Yeah, tummy trouble.
What'd you say? Yeah, exactly. Okay. Christianity comes and says, God came down in flesh. And that wasn't just a stumbling block for the Greeks, by the way. That was a stumbling block for the Jews. But think about this. God didn't just come in the flesh, he came in weakness. So the Romans, power. And you're going to tell me that God's doing something in the world, okay, first of all, through the Jews. Right? The Jews were not well liked in the ancient world. Palestine was like, that's where you got assigned. If you were like in Roman politics and you got like a job in Palestine, you're like, I just got sent to the graveyard. It's a terrible place. You don't want to be working there. Like, the people are miserable, they're fanatics, okay? The Romans looked at Christianity and they thought, this is pathetic. You're trying to pitch a Messiah that was so ineffective as a leader, he couldn't even get 12 guys together to stick up for him in a fight. They all ran away. One of them betrayed him. What kind of leader is that? And then he couldn't even defend himself at the trial. He was executed as a common criminal. Pfft, that's not God. Whatever God is, it's not that. Would have made it really hard for Romans, power people, to believe. Now listen, think about the Jews. Okay, very, very religious. And the Messiah comes from, not Jerusalem, Galilee? Galilee is like kind of the bayou. It's like Louisiana, you know, the hillbilly country. All right? Messiah is going to be born to a peasant girl out of wedlock? You've got to be kidding me. That is so dishonorable. Surely God would never do anything like that. Do you see what I'm saying? There are all sorts of things in the story that made it hard for Jews to believe, Gentiles to believe, Romans to believe, anybody with a brain to believe. And that's not a defect of Christianity. Christianity says that's by design. God put stumbling blocks in there. And listen, Jesus does it too. So don't just think this is the Christians writing this stuff down. Do you remember what Jesus says in John 14? He says, no one can come to the Father unless he comes through me. I'm the way, the truth, and the life. Nobody comes to the Father except through me. Good grief. Jesus, that sounds really exclusive. That's going to make it hard for people down the road once we know about the world and all these cultures to believe. Jesus is like, no, it's true. And by the way, nobody comes to me unless the Father draws him. Good grief. That's John 6. Look at the serious religious people that Jesus critiques. They read their Bibles. They give money. They do the things that are commanded in there. And Jesus looks at some of those religious people and he says, listen, tax collectors and prostitutes are entering the kingdom ahead of you. That's Matthew 21. Jesus, how is anybody going to follow you saying stuff like that? Do you see what I'm saying? Let me give you another one. Jesus says that your attitude about yourself, if you exalt yourself, if you look in the mirror and are proud about yourself, if you think you're pretty good, if you think you're better than others, you are actually in grave danger of being humbled and missing God. That's Luke 18, which we're going to look at today. But if you are completely humbled by yourself, you look in the mirror and you're like, I am a failure. You're over yourself. He says, oh, you're actually on the road to being found by God. That is so counterintuitive. Okay? All over the New Testament, you see Jesus and Paul and Peter saying things that are challenging and offensive. And listen, look at the passage we just read, spent 4 weeks on. Okay? Romans 9, previous page, verse, what is it? It's verse 18. So the Lord has mercy on whomever he wills, and he hardens whomever he wills. Do you hear the challenge in that? Okay, now listen, think about this for a second. When you hear that, and I know you find it challenging because we spent the past 4 weeks hearing how you're like, oh, that's really challenging. Is your response, that's not fair? Or is it, Lord, have mercy? Look, think about this. Do you see the difference? In other words, God has mercy on whom he wills and he hardens whom he wills. Some people are going to look at that and go, that's not fair. And other people are going to look at that and go, he has mercy on who he wants, so they ask for it. Do you see the difference? Okay. Challenge. Scandal. All right. If Paul were here, I think he would say that God uses scandal, uses those challenging things to filter and reveal. Now, what do I mean by that? Filter. You're not going to like this. God actually wants to filter out people who are easily offended by a sovereign God. Now, you nodded your head. Okay, I won't tell anybody, don't worry. All right. Listen, God wants to filter out people who are easily offended. So he's not afraid to offend. And he wants to reveal, he wants to show us how we're approaching him. So he actually says these really challenging things that are really revealing. Now let me give you an example. Have you ever known somebody that has had a drinking problem, like you've had a friend that had a drinking problem before they knew they had a drinking problem? All right? And if you're like, hey, I think you have a drinking problem, how do they react? Badly. They are offended by it. But you see that same person down the road when they realize they have a drinking problem, they start going to AA. What are they saying? My name's Christian and I have a... They're actually not offended by it. They're starting from it. And what he's getting at is God is saying, I'm going to use challenging things to actually filter people that are easily offended and to reveal what your stumbling blocks are, because I want you to wrestle with those things. Okay, so that's the breadth of the scandal. Now listen, let's talk about the depth of the scandal, because that's actually what Paul is trying to show us here in Romans 10 and 9, the last part of 9. Paul wants to show us how deep and how dangerous this problem is. Okay? And he's going to show us something scandalous to illustrate it. So look at verse 30. What shall we say then? That the Gentiles who did not pursue righteousness have attained it. Now listen, righteousness, what does that mean? Righteousness, have you heard that word before? Yeah. Righteousness, now maybe you haven't thought of it this way. Righteousness is identity language. It's what makes me right, what makes me okay. Okay, and I'm going to say more on that in just a second. How do I know that I'm right and I'm okay? Now, if you're talking to a religious person, usually they're thinking of righteousness, I'm right or okay, in conjunction to God. But guess what? Irreligious people do it too. How do I know I'm right or I'm okay? Paul's looking at religious folks, but even irreligious people seek righteousness. And this is what he says. I want you to follow the logic on this. It's very simple. He says Gentiles, irreligious people, pagan people, sinner people, okay, people that weren't pursuing God. They weren't pursuing righteousness with God. He's go, somehow those people who weren't pursuing it and don't seem to have it, found it. And then he says, Israel, the most religious people on the planet at the time, okay, maybe still, like Orthodox Jews, very religious. They read the Bible, they do what it says. They try hard to take everything serious. And he looks at this people who are pursuing God hard for everything we can see and tell. And he says somehow they missed it. Do you feel the scandal in that? In other words, the very people that are seeking God don't seem to find him. And the people that aren't seeking God and certainly don't seem to deserve it, somehow get it. And he goes, and then he quotes Isaiah and he goes, this is part of the fabric of salvation. It's the way God works and it's the way the gospel works, and you need to understand it. Now,
thief on the cross.
What'd you say?
Thief on the cross.
Thief on the cross, yeah. Thief on the cross gets in. He's done terrible things. All right?
Do you think like pursuing righteousness for itself, like there's like no humility in that feeling?
Okay, we're going to unpack this. I want you to think about this because you just said something, and I'm not going to say it just yet because it's my next point. All right? Way to jump ahead. But let me say this. When God makes this distinction, this is an important, just note. This is not God being arbitrary, where he's like, anybody who looks for me, I'm going to hide myself. Anybody who doesn't look for me, I'm going to reveal myself. What it actually is, Paul is saying that he's using Jews, but this is true of any religious people. He's saying they pursued it by works. And for the Jews, that would have specifically meant the law. But any religious person, however you define the law, in other words, they're like, we're going to pursue God, and here's what we need to do in order to do it. However you define law. This is the thing that I'm going to do, say, believe, practice, whatever. It's going to make me right. The Gentiles who failed at religion, they weren't good at it. They were pagans. They were sinners. They despaired of works. Those people actually found it via faith. In other words, he's saying there is a Somewhere in the depths of this, there's a pattern of if somebody is seeking to kind of perform their way to God, they're going to miss him. But if somebody despairs of performance and just receives and trusts, they somehow find him. Okay? Now listen, this is the part that we've got to unpack. Paul has just made the case that God is absolutely sovereign. Okay, I'm putting this in Romans context. Romans 9. God's absolutely sovereign. He's free. He is in control. However, we made the case that Paul's view of humanity is we're like qualified sovereignty. We have huge agency and thus huge responsibility. Okay? And then, this is where we ended last week. There's all of this language of call and promise in Romans 9. Okay? So God's in control, but you have responsibility, and then there's call language. Now listen, I want you to think for a second about God's call, because that's all through the Bible too. Do you remember in the Old Testament, God says things like, I will be your God and you will be my people. And then he says, now keep my commands. Act like it. All right? You say, okay, what are the commands? Oh, how about thou shalt not murder, adultery, steal, bear false witness. Okay, 10 Commandments. But there's more than just the 10 Commandments. The Old Testament talks about seeking justice, caring about the poor, caring about the orphans and widows. No idols. Okay, more commands. Now listen, when you get to the New Testament, are there commands in the New Testament? Yes, there are. Jesus says, take up your cross and follow me. That's a command. James 1:22 says, don't just listen to the word and so deceive yourselves. Do what it says. In other words, any kind of faith that doesn't result in action isn't real faith. Call. Okay? Romans 8 and Romans 9. Basically, if you go through and look, where do I see the word call in there, in those two chapters? There is all this call language that God has given his people a calling and a purpose. Okay? God's sovereign, but you have agency. Now here's the call. So guess what? It's really, really easy to do. It's easy to hear, okay, God's sovereign. Fine. Okay? You have agency. That's true. You have a calling. That's true too. So what do? You get busy doing it. You work. And actually what Paul is saying is when you're doing that religious work, do you know what you're doing? You're constructing an identity for yourself that lets you feel good about yourself because you've done enough, so God has to bless me. But what I'm really doing when I do that is I'm relying on myself, not on God. Okay? That is the way of Peter. He's like, Lord, even if everybody else leaves you, I'm not going to. And Jesus goes, yes, you are. You're going to deny me 3 times. You're going to run away. Now, listen. This is moving us in the direction, when I talk about identity, something I'm calling identity politics. And I just want to say, identity politics, I don't even know how many of you know what I'm talking about. I'm going to try to explain my understanding. I know, Anna, you've thought a lot about this. But this is a modern conversation. But the underlying ideas behind identity politics are actually as old as the hills. And I think Paul, if he were here, in other words, I can't look in the concordance of my Bible and look up identity politics. It's not there. But Paul's talking about it right here. He is talking. If Paul were sitting here today and you brought up identity politics, he would say, oh, I know exactly what you're talking about. And this is why the gospel is so important for this. This is what I think Paul would say. Any identity that you build for yourself where your righteousness, your I'm okayness depends on you, fundamentally is unstable and self-defeating, and it's a dead end. Because you're constantly afraid of failure, of not measuring up, and you're constantly threatened by anybody with a different standard that might disagree with you. Okay, now let me give you a couple examples. And I'm going to start with some secular examples. If you make beauty your righteousness. You look in the mirror and you say, you know what? Here's how I know I'm okay. I'm actually more beautiful than a lot of people. Do you know what actually happens? You will be terrified of losing your beauty. You will feel really self-conscious around anybody else that's more beautiful than you. Okay? And if somebody calls you ugly, it will cut you right to the heart. Do you see what I'm saying? Your identity is unstable because it's based on you. Now let me give you another example. What if you make wealth your righteousness? In other words, here's how I know I'm okay. I've got enough money that I'm never going to have to worry about anything. Well, guess what? First of all, it'll never be enough. Second of all, you will actually be deeply fearful of losing it. And you will be jealous and insecure when other people have more than you do. In other words, that identity, look at wealthy people. They're not very happy. Did you know that Americans, there was an article in the Wall Street Journal that just came out a couple of weeks ago talking about Americans are more miserable than ever. And what's interesting about it is we have the upper wealthy, upper middle class, the highest percentage of wealth, that's the largest it's ever been. We're not having less people get rich. People are moving upwards. The smallest, all the categories over the last 40 years, the lowest categories have all gotten smaller. The category that's gotten the biggest is this super wealthy. And we are more miserable than ever. And Paul goes, duh, you're building your righteousness on your wealth. Let me give you another example. If you make politics your righteousness or political positions or whatever it is, you will be deeply anxious anytime your particular group of people aren't in power. So when your team loses, you're like, the world's going to, it's going to end. And what will happen is you will tend to demonize your opponents. You will tend to try to take control and get power, because you're basing your identity on it. Now listen, take everything I just said and apply it to God's law. Religious stuff. If you go to God's principles and say, I'm going to make that, you know what? I'm going to make this Bible my righteousness. Okay? I'm just going to do it. Everything in there, I'm going to obey it. You know what's going to happen? You're not going to do it very well. Not if you're honest with yourself. And so you will end up being racked by fear or the knowledge that you're not really measuring up. That you're deep down, you're a fraud spiritually. So you will surround yourself with people that prop you up and make you feel like you're okay. And you will look down on people that don't measure up. Okay? And you will be threatened by anything that reveals you or anyone that challenges you. Your religious identity, when it's based on yourself, is deeply unstable because it's built on yourself. Look at Romans 10, verse 3. This is what he's saying the Jews were doing, by and large. Being ignorant of the righteousness of God. In other words, they didn't understand how rightness works. Seeking to establish their own. You hear the identity language there? They did not submit to God's righteousness. They actually couldn't receive what was freely offered. They're like, no, I've got to make and do it myself. I've got to create it. And so what they were really doing is trusting in themselves rather than in the promises of God. And he's saying that is an unstable identity. Now listen, why is Paul pressing this point? Because Paul knows that irreligious people have built their identities in other places, and then they start finding out, you know what, I built my identity on beauty, that didn't work. I built my identity on wealth, that didn't work. I built my identity on career, that didn't work. I did all these things. And you know what happens oftentimes to really irreligious people? They find religion. And they're like, oh, I need to do the God thing. And you know what they do? They get into religion of the exact same premise. I need to this is how I'm going to build my identity. And he says, if you do that, you will fundamentally miss God. because you don't understand the nature of Christianity. Christianity is the only faith that I know that says this. Okay? Real Christianity is different. It involves an alien identity that is freely given. It's gifted. And all you can do is receive it and trust that you got it. Okay, now do you see why he's doing it? So he's going here because he knows he's talking about sovereignty and calling, and he knows that some people are going to hear this and go, okay, let's get busy with the call. And he goes, don't miss it. Don't just jump to the call. You've got to understand the scandal of the gospel and how you can't build your identity on how well you do the call. Okay, so the power of the gospel. This is the third point. I want you to flip back to Luke chapter 18. And we've preached through this. I've preached through this before, so I'm not gonna spend a ton of time here. I just want to read through it slowly. Luke chapter 18. Anytime you read Romans 9 and the first part of 10, you should have in your Bible written, go read Luke 18, verses 9 through 14. Okay? Jesus told them this parable. Listen to who he tells it to. He's got a mixed group. To those who trusted in themselves that they were righteous. Do you hear the identity language there? They're building identity based on how they've done something. And guess what happens? They treat others with contempt. You see it? It's exactly what we just said. He's looking at people who have a religious identity, and it actually causes them to disdain other people who don't measure up to him. Okay, and he says, you've got a problem. You're doing this religious thing. You don't even understand the power of God. You don't understand how the gospel works. Okay, so he tells them a parable. He says there were two men who walked into the temple to pray. Basically, he's saying, let me tell you how God views these people. Okay, one of them, this is verse 11, is a Pharisee. He is religious. Okay, do you hear the standing by himself, prayed thus to God. And you got to say this in like a British voice. Like, Lord, thank you that I'm not like other men, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even like this tax collector here. Do you hear the comparison? Everything we just said about identity politics ultimately ends up comparing yourself against other people. And he's saying, here's what religious people do. They end up comparing themselves against other people and looking down on other people and feeling superior to other people because they're doing this thing. Then he looks. Now listen, I want you to think about this. How do you think all the religious people felt when they heard Jesus say this?
We don't do that.
They probably were pissed. They would have found this offensive. They would have said, we're just trying to do what God says. And he says, you're not thinking hard enough about your doing. Okay. Then he says, look at verse 11, or verse 13. The tax collector. And this one's hard because in our culture, none of you probably know anybody that works for the IRS. Like we're kind of, you don't despise that very much, probably. So I need to think of another example, somebody you find despicable.
ICE.
What'd you say? ICE. Or how about this? A congressman, a Republican congressman from Texas. All right? In other words, okay, now I'm not naming any names. The point is, though, every single one of you, and some people are going to find, like if you live in the suburbs, you're probably like, oh, there's that blue Democrat named Jim Tallarico. Like, what I'm getting at is, no matter where you are, there's probably somebody you despise. And Jesus picks a person that everybody in the room would have despised, a tax collector, because he's working for the Romans and he's extorting money from his own people. Okay? Somebody who's despicable. He stands at the back of the room. He doesn't raise his eyes towards heaven. He knows he has nothing to commend himself to God. In other words, this guy, the one thing he's sure of, he is a spiritual failure. He's probably morally bankrupt. Okay? And what does he say? How does he commend himself to God? He doesn't. Lord, have mercy on me, a sinner. He takes his own identity as a complete failure, and he basically goes, well, here's all I got. Have mercy on me, a sinner. He's giving to God his broken identity. What does he get back? Think about this. Look at verse 14. Jesus says, I tell you the truth, this man went down to his house justified rather than the other. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and everyone who humbles himself will be exalted. Listen, you want to know what God's response back was to this guy? Oh, hey, good. Number one, you're honest. Okay. Number two, you're actually humble. Ooh, this is excellent. You have been humbled by yourself. And then number three, Jesus says, this man goes down justified. That's righteousness language. All he's done is call on the Lord to have mercy. And Jesus goes, God is now your friend. So you know what identity this guy gets back? Here's what you need to see with the gospel. You go to God with nothing and recognizing you have nothing. And what God gives you back is sonship, friendship. You are a friend of God. It's a gift. Okay? That's his identity now. And listen, Jesus was famous for being friends with these kinds of people. If you ask them, tax collector types, what makes you okay? The answer is nothing. I'm a wreck. And if you say to them, surely you're not that bad, they're like, no, you have no idea. If you could see what's inside of me, I have nothing to commend myself to God. Okay? And Jesus goes, that's the kind of person I'm going to be friends with. Now listen, this is why Martin Luther talks about alien righteousness. He said Christians have a righteousness that didn't come from themselves. It came from somebody else, Jesus and the Father. It was given as a gift, and all you can do is receive it. And when you receive it, here's what it does. It destroys identity politics. I'm going to give you two examples, and we can talk about it over lunch. Number one, it is deeply humbling. When you go to God and say, I have nothing to commend myself, and he's like, oh, you're right. You're such a mess, I had to send my son to die for you.
It's grace.
If somebody actually needs to die for you, that is really humbling. But here's what humbling does to you. How can you look at anybody else with condescension? You can't. In other words, if you're really seen, I'm not saying that Christians don't struggle with this, but what I'm saying is that when the gospel is clear in front of your eyes, you will not look at other people. You will be incredibly compassionate towards other people because you know that you are at least as bad and probably worse than they are. And that right there blows up the first part of the identity politic. Okay? Because here's the second part. In other words, you're not going to be condescending. You're not going to treat people as less than you. You're actually going to look at everybody as probably, frankly, better than you. Okay? Here's the second part. Not only is this scandalous thing deeply humbling, but it is also deeply affirming. In other words, when you say, I have everything from God, I am okay because of what Jesus has done for me. This is very Jesus-centric. If somebody tries to say, listen, I want this kind of like identity, but I don't really want the Jesus part, God loves people. That's very generic. It's much different than God loved you so much that Jesus entered this earth and lived as a human being and suffered and died in your place. See, that's the affirming part. The first part is like, you have no worth whatsoever in yourself, but you are valuable because somebody else found you worth dying for. And that is massively affirming. You are so loved. And the place you see it's on the cross. I am so loved by this man, not just then, but right now in this life. Okay? Now listen, when you feel deeply affirmed that way, do you know what that does when others critique you? You're like, okay, now critique still hurts. Okay? But you can actually handle it. Because you're like, you know what? No matter how, you're ugly. You're like, listen, even if you're not ugly, I'm getting older and I'm like, I used to be, back in the day, I had hair. And I was like, hey, I had, like, you see the wedding college pictures? And I'm like, you know, I could at least kind of look like this. And now I look in the mirror and I'm like, Christian, you are getting old. All right? The hair, like everything's starting to go. And you start to realize, you know what? My value is not in my appearance. And what happens is then when somebody comes and goes, you're ugly, you're kind of like, I know. Hey, guess what? We're all going to be that way. And it depressurizes, it doesn't land. Okay, and all of those things, okay, so you take like wealth. You're like, what if I lose all my wealth? I know that God will take care of me.
Yeah.
Okay? What if I lose my health? You're like, it's okay. I'm going to live forever with Jesus, even if I die right now. Like it starts to radically renovate. Okay? And what that does is that, listen, in Jesus, the greatest critique and affirmation you will ever receive when he is present before your eyes, it breaks the chain of what other people say about you. And that has the potential to destroy identity politics. So where I'm going with this, and this is, you know, what I wanted to say about identity politics, is the gospel is the only thing I know that gives you an identity that is grounded in something outside of yourself and that has massive potential to change how you live and how you move through this life. And that's what Christianity is about. And if you don't understand that, you will miss Christianity. It'll just be religion to you, okay? And at the heart of it is Jesus. So listen, we're going to talk about this over lunch. Let me pray and let's come to the Lord's Supper, all right?